Going to do the format a little differently. Tamara and I agreed that we were going to do questions and answers. We worked up some questions between the two of us. So I'm going to be asking questions of Tamara. She's got, I'm sure, all the answers already plotted out. And then after that, we'll turn to questions and comments from all of you. I will try to control it. We've got a large group tonight. So I will, if you wave your hand, I will try to write your name down and then call on you in order to keep us in some sort of arrangement. So tonight we're really delighted to have with us Tamara Copeland. She spent a lifetime in nonprofit management, a lot of it dealing with racial equity with children. And for a dozen years, she was head of the Washington Regional Association of Grant Makers, knowing a lot about philanthropy here in our city. After she retired, however, she wrote this, a book, oh, can you see it? I guess not, which is called Daughters of the Dream, 8 Girls from Richmond Who Grew Up in the Civil Rights Era. If you haven't read it, great read, reads just really easily and gives you a lot of background on Richmond, on society, and life in general. Now, the village has a new group of people who are interested in writing memoirs. And I know that there are some of them here tonight with us. So Tamara, let's start with the book rather than with your background. You've written this memoir, but it seems to me it's more than a memoir. It combines the texture of political analysis with the story of you and your friends. So why did you write it that way? And who did you think was your audience?
So when you say it like that, Trudy, it sounds very lofty. Political analysis. I didn't feel like that's what I was doing. So let me just say that there's a group of women, 8 of us, who have been friends for 60 years. So we were friends in the 1st grade. And we remained friends probably until about college, went off to college. And then we were separated for about 20 years and came back together in our 40s and have been connected ever since. So to get to the question about why did I write it, at first it was my friend Renee's book. Renee was going to write this book, but then she never had time. And the reason that she was going to write it, Trudy, was that so many people kept saying to her, how in the world have you guys stayed as friends for so long? And so I thought that I would write this book about friendship. But when I started writing it, I realized that the book that was solely about friendship was really Renee's book. My book was something else. While friendship was at the core, that these 8 folks who've been friends for a long time, and that certainly was at the core. What I realized was whenever we got together, we would always be talking about some issue that had a racial justice thrust to it, or we went out to eat a lot. So we'd be going to a Black-owned restaurant, or we'd go to a theater and see a movie or a play that had a Black theme to it, or a restaurant or whatever, or an art exhibit. And so that became really pivotal to me to include in this memoir about our friendship. And then, Trudy, you ask, who was the audience? I haven't a clue. I mean, so when I was writing it, I was just writing it because I wanted to capture our story. But I realized later that part of what I wanted to portray was the ordinary life of 8 African-American girls, women, who grew up in a very middle-class family, all of us. We were all in Leave It to Beaver kinds of families in a Leave It to Beaver neighborhood. And so much of what is written about African Americans focuses on the pathology of families, that I just wanted to tell an ordinary story of ordinary people. And so the fact that folks are here and interested in hearing about it always surprises me. So thank you all for being here.
One of the women who is almost your contemporary, Anna Deavere Smith,
Yes.
the famous playwright and activist, recently wrote an essay about her life as she was growing up in 1950. Well, she was born in 1950. She grew up in Baltimore,
Yeah.
not too far away. And she titled her essay, "We Were the Last of the Nice Negro Girls."
Mhm.
Does that resonate with your experience?
Absolutely. And with several of my friends' experience. When you say the nice Negro girls, we grew up in an era where certainly Negro was the term of choice. But more importantly than that, we grew up in an era when Black people were really trying to get what white people had. We were doing that via legislation, the civil rights legislation, but it was really to get access to what the white community had. And I think it's important to note that we were still in an era of not celebrating quite yet who we were and who we are as Black people. So the whole notion of being Black, even and using that term, even African American or the term Black, those were not terms that were celebrated, but they became celebrated. And so I often say to people, I didn't become Black until I went to college. And it's not about, it's part of it is about a mental state, and part of it is about kind of a perspective on who you are and how you fit into the world. So I think it's interesting that Anna Deavere Smith, she talks about in that article going to Arcadia College or Arcadia University. I think it had another name when she went there to school. And she was one of a handful of African-American students. For some reason, I want to say 7, but I don't know if that's true. I went to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. There were 40 Black students out of 4,000. And I was listening to a podcast in which Nicole Hannah-Jones was talking about going to Notre Dame, which is where she went to school. And it's interesting because she's a generation younger than I am. So it's unfortunate that she still felt the same way. Because her comment was that when she was looking at colleges, she only applied to Notre Dame. I applied to tons of colleges, but she only applied to Notre Dame. And she went to Notre Dame because she wanted to go to a prestigious school. And I'm not going to remember exactly her quote, Trudy, but it's something like, she didn't want to have to, all of her life, convince people that she was a smart Black woman. So therefore, by being accepted into a school that had a level of prestige, that she thought that that would be part of how she was seen. And that was true of me going to William and Mary. The William and Mary was a very well-respected university in Virginia. And so when my parents' friends or family members learned that that's where I had made the decision to attend William and Mary, they were always very proud of the fact that I had been accepted into William and Mary. Today, when I tell people, particularly Black people, that I went to William and Mary, their question is why? And I know and fully understand both perspectives. So when I read the Anna Deavere Smith article about the last of the nice Negro girls, we were expected to behave a certain way and to be ready to walk through those doors of opportunity when they opened. And it's, my life kind of crossed the nexus of the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement. So I graduated from college at a time when, I was essentially the flavor of the month, so there were people who were looking to hire more qualified African American people. And if you were a woman, my goodness, you're a two for them. So it certainly was the time that I can appreciate what she was saying and have essentially the same feeling about the last of the nice Negro girls.
One of the really interesting parts of your book is the discussion that your parents had as to whether or not to send you to a white junior high, was it?
Mm-hmm.
When the city finally opened schools to mixed race attendance. Will you talk a little bit about that and that experience?
Sure. So I went to a segregated school for the first 5 grades. And I suspect most of you went to a segregated school as well. You probably wouldn't have thought about it that way, but I bet you did. And so I went to Albert V. Norrell Elementary School in Richmond, named after a Black educator. And I will get to your question, but I wanted to say what I appreciated about that school was it had the first African American woman principal in the city of Richmond. So everybody in that school, from the principal to the janitorial staff, all of the teaching staff, everybody was fully committed to my success. Not just my success, everybody's success. And there was a level of nurturance in that school building that I think is or was phenomenal. And I'm not so sure that it exists in schools today. Perhaps it does. But I knew that everybody there, everybody wanted me to succeed. And when we had assemblies, they would play the Negro National Anthem, which is Lift Every Voice and Sing. And the principal, Ms. Overby, I remember this like yesterday. Ms. Overby would say, "Now children, please stand." And we would all stand and we would all sing the song. And there was a sense of pride, a sense of acceptance and pride. I learned a lot about Black history going to that school. But when I graduated from the 5th grade, which was as far as that particular school went, my parents had a choice. So they could send me to the feeder school that would take me to another segregated school, Baker Elementary, or they could send me to J.E.B. Stewart, Jeb Stewart Elementary, or the 6th grade, only 1 grade. And that was the feeder school into the white schools. And my parents made the decision for me to go to Jeb Stewart School. And just as an aside, Jeb Stewart School just changed their name maybe a year, 2 years ago, and they are now Barack Obama Elementary School. That's a whole nother story. But they made that decision. And I think that was part of the wanting to be accepted by the white community, the wanting the stamp of approval that you received at that time from the white community, and not quite being at the place of fully celebrating who we were and are as African Americans. So yes, my parents did send me to that school, and it's interesting because my teacher there, Mr. Yearwood, George Yearwood, and I remember that he came to my house. So my house was maybe 7 blocks from the school, something like that. And I remember my parents and I were in the backyard, and all of a sudden Mr. Yearwood was at the gate. And I'm sure he had rang the bell, but we hadn't heard, and we were in the backyard. And I suspect that my parents were shocked that this white teacher was at their backyard gate. I was just shocked because my teacher was there. And I didn't know, why does your teacher come to your house? So he had come to my home to convince my parents that I should skip the 6th grade, that I didn't need to be in his class. And I'm glad that my parents made the decision for me to stay in the 6th grade and to stay with that same group of friends who were part of the 8 girls from Richmond. And half of those girls went to Baker, the Black school, and half went to Stewart. And then we reconnected when we finally got to what was then called junior high school for the 7th and 8th grade.
Well, I'm sure people are going to have a lot of questions about how you fared during those years. But in the interest of time, let me get to another part of your story. There are a lot of people in the audience, I think, who have been firsts, especially women who have been firsts.
Yeah.
But almost all of the women in the audience who have been first with white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
How was it different, do you think, being a first without white privilege?
Well, I wasn't quite a first. First, let me say that. So I was more of the second tier of kids of African-American kids integrating schools in Richmond. So I wasn't a first, but I fully appreciate your question. And I suspect that one of the differences in being a white person, particularly, I guess, a white woman who is the first in a profession or whatever, I suspect that there were few instances when your life was in danger. And that's really part of being a first as an African American. Typically, wherever you are, there is a large group of people who don't want you there. So the death threats, for example, that came to Jackie Robinson when he became the first African American to play Major League Baseball in 1947. He suffered an enormous number of death threats, but also of people literally throwing cleats at him, throwing bats at him, that his life was in jeopardy. So when white people, particularly white women, are a first, that their lives are in jeopardy. But I think that what that question opens up, Trudy, is to some degree what I think of as the invisibility of racism. So for many white people, you don't think about where Black people can't go or what Black people can't do. So to think about something, did you think about the fact that Black people weren't playing baseball? Probably not. There's the Negro League over there, and then there was the major leagues, and you didn't think about the fact that Black people couldn't play baseball. Or to think about something like Miss America, the Miss America contest. And I don't even know if they have Miss America anymore. But anyway, Miss America, in their bylaws, said you had to be white until 1970. There wasn't a Black CEO of a Fortune 500 company until 1999. That wasn't that long ago. You think about, what is his name? Doug Williams, who played football for the Washington team. The first African-American quarterback to play for a team that went to the Super Bowl, because many people thought that Black people weren't smart enough to steer a football team. They couldn't be the quarterback. They couldn't make those on-the-minute decisions to lead the team. So the answer to your question really is, I think that the biggest difference is how your life is threatened when you are a first. And even in those instances where your life may not be in jeopardy by someone wanting to literally kill you, I think there are many times, if not most, where the stress of being first and the stress of knowing that you have to behave in a certain way, dress in a certain way, speak a certain way, because you are representing an entire race, where white people typically represent their family. You don't have the added burden and the added stress of feeling that you have to represent a whole race. So there are quite a few differences between being the first as a white person or a specific religion, when you were the first, when they're still talking about the fact that Joe Biden is only the second Catholic president. So there certainly are places in which those conversations arise, but I think the stress of being the first African American or the potential for bodily harm is real.
Mhm. You've talked about philanthropy as being a way to start to bridge the gaps and the understandings, bring understanding to the differences between the experience of white people in this country, Black people. How do you see that working through philanthropy?
Well, philanthropy is often referred to as society's passing gear. It affords the opportunity for kind of R&D, for research and development, to test new approaches. People who have a significant amount of wealth that they either set up a family foundation, or corporations who decide that part of their profits are going toward philanthropy, that they are often heard, philanthropic leaders are often heard in communities in a very different way because they control money. So when I was with the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers and we made the decision to do some work on race and racism, that we specifically decided to focus on racism, because people often talked at the time about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we wanted to say was that there is a reality of structural racism that is hidden. It's kind of like the bottom of the iceberg. So you may see the presenting reality at the top, but what undergirds that? What is the basis of that? And so we made the conscious decision to focus on racism, and we did a series for CEOs of foundations and corporate giving programs and their board trustees that was called Putting Racism on the Table. And it was a structured approach to learning, because you think about it that few people, I won't say no one, few people have probably been through high school, college, grad school, law school, you pick it, where you had a structured introduction to the topic of race and racism. It's not something we talk about. And because the white community has not learned about the pervasiveness of structural racism in our country, that we made the decision that we were going to do a 6-month series, not a long time, but 6 months, once a month, for 3 hours a session, where we had a academic come in and talk about some aspect of race and racism. So this was in 2016, and then we repeated it in 2018. So now I suspect that there are probably many people on this call who know the name Ibram Kendi, but people didn't at the time. Ibram Kendi wrote Stamped from the Beginning, which is a history of racist ideas in America. And then he also wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I think he also has another book that just came out. But he was one of the speakers, as was Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility, that I think people are familiar with. So we had speakers of that caliber who came in and talked about their area of specialty for about an hour. Then we had a facilitated conversation for 2 hours. Because we did this work, and we really were ahead of the curve in doing this, and this is 2016. So the proliferation of conversations now about race and racism is relatively recent. Some are as recent, of course, as 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, but others are still within the last 2, 3, 4 years. So we were a bit ahead of the curve to introduce that topic. But because philanthropy was talking about it, then the nonprofit sector had permission to talk about it, their grantees. In fact, not only did they have permission, they were asked questions. What is the diversity of your staff? What is the diversity of your board? How are you addressing structural racism? What is the distinction between being charitable and being transformational? So there were lots of questions that started to be asked in the community that were different from what had been asked in the past. And it wasn't just in philanthropy. Then it started moving into government. Fairfax County now has a racial equity officer. They didn't have that before. So the other communities in the DMV and in the district and Maryland and Virginia. So there are conversations that are occurring across our region that didn't occur until philanthropy started talking about this topic.
Would you apply it also to today's problems that Asian Americans are having?
Yes, absolutely. I typically don't talk about other communities because I don't know their experience, but I certainly recognize racism when I see it. And so the fact that we have a virus that started in an Asian country, and since then that there seems to be a number of people of Asian heritage that are being attacked on the streets for no particular reason, or restaurants that are people are not patronizing as much as they have in the past, that I certainly think, Trudy, that that's a reality in our country.
So a final question to bring this to a little lighter end.
Yes.
Is it true that you really used to tootle around on a motorcycle?
Oh yeah, that's very true. When I went to William & Mary, I didn't have a car, but when I went to William & Mary, you couldn't have a car as a freshman. And kind of in passing, I said to my grandmother, I was the only grandchild on one side. And I said to that grandmother, I sure would like to have a little scooter, like a little motorbike for graduation from high school. And she gave me one. And so, yeah, and I had to go and get a motorcycle license, because even though it was a small bike, and really more like the little European motor scooters with the flaps in the front, and so it was like that. It wasn't anything high end. It probably didn't go over 50 miles an hour, maybe 60. But I had to have a license. So I had to go to the DMV, and you had to take the test, and you had to go in between the cones and do that and not fall off. So yeah, I did. I had this little motor scooter at William & Mary for 2 years. And then when I was able to have a car on campus, my parents gave me a car, and I passed on my motorcycle and sold it to some freshmen at school. So yeah, it was fun though. I really enjoyed it. It was fun. Probably perfect for the hill, actually.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tamara. This has been a great conversation. Now let me open it up to other people. If you would raise your hand, I will recognize you, and let's see who's got questions.
Who's thinking about writing a memoir? Judy.
Zanillo had one.
Oh, did I see a Zaniello have a question as well?
Yeah, Fran.
No. Oh,
Fran or
okay.
Tom?
Well, I can ask my question, which is so I mean, Tamara, Tamara, I always forget how to. Sorry.
Tamara is right. Think of the
Tamara,
next day.
All I know is that I've gotten it wrong, and so now I'm self-conscious about getting it right, and I can never remember which one is right, but I know I've gotten it wrong, so I apologize.
Think of the next day. Think of it that way.
Tomorrow. Okay. Yep. Got it. Tomorrow. I am someone who was heavily influenced by putting racism on the table, both as the deputy director of a nonprofit organization that got funds from the local funders who were part of the Washington Regional Collaborative, and then also having participated in it, taken in some of the lectures and things myself. What do you think from that experience? What is the hardest thing for the white audiences of that series to get, do you think? What's the sort of sticking point?
I really think, Judy, that it's not recognizing the pervasiveness of racism. I think there is an invisibility that, was anybody surprised by Meghan Markle's comment that there was concern about the color of her child? No Black person was surprised by that. I don't know if white people were surprised, but no Black person was surprised by that. So, I think every day something happens that reminds me about race and racism in this country. And I mean every day. So when I talk to my white friends,
got a chat.
They talk about this when I bring it up, or when something happens in the world that causes the topic to be front and center.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality that is faced by African Americans or Asian Americans, as Trudy mentioned, or other people of color in this country is not typically top of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot that has been happening over the last few years, particularly via cell phone videos, that have elevated for the white community the reality of race and racism. But if you think about it, without those cell phone videos, let's just George Floyd. If you didn't see that, and someone said to you, well, wait a minute, a police officer had his knee on this man's neck for 8.5 or whatever minutes, what had he done? You must be exaggerating. It couldn't have been 8 minutes. Nobody would have done that. So the fact that we literally watched that on television, because we were all watching television because of the pandemic, that I think that reality is understood differently because so many people saw it. You may have different feelings about what happened, but you saw it. So those cell phone videos have made the difference in the way that I think seeing the dogs attack children during the civil rights movement, or adults, but those vicious dogs attacking people who were peaceful protesters, that left an image, and that provoked thinking that was different. But I think that, Judy, just to really get to the core of your question, I think that many white people don't understand racism and haven't been exposed to thinking about it in a way that is meaningful.
Let me remind people that you can comment in the chat. Twyla's been doing some very good comments, so do take a look at them. Tom and Friends and Yellow, you had a hand up, I think, so no?
Patricia Mulumby.
Do we have someone else, Patricia? Aha, Susan Sarfati.
Yes, hi. I wonder, I hear a lot, especially through my work, volunteer work at the African American Museum, that white people just don't understand because they can't or have not walked in the shoes. So what are the things that you think are critical for us to do so we can understand?
Well, first, you will never walk in the shoes. So I
know that, yeah.
So I would not have said that. But I do think that there are ways for you to understand the experience at a different level. So for example, there's a woman named Debbie Irving who's written a book called Waking Up White, a white woman. And her book is about, I think she was in grad school, and she was in class and the professor was talking about the GI Bill and how returning soldiers had benefited from the GI Bill. And then this professor mentioned that African Americans really couldn't access the GI Bill because we couldn't get loans from banks to be able to access the benefits of the GI Bill. And she came home and was talking to her husband and she said, "Do you know how we got this house?" And he didn't know this was a Jeopardy question. He just kind of went at it and said, "Well, we looked at tons of houses and then finally we found this one." And she said, "No, we got this house because my father was able to give us the down payment on this house." And you know why he was able to give us the down payment? Because he was a successful lawyer and he had the resources to do it. You know why he was a successful lawyer? Because he went to law school on the GI Bill. And she went on and on about how, and for her, this was the light bulb moment, that she hadn't thought about the fact that others couldn't access that. So I think that, Susan, for my answer is to do more conversations like the one we're having this evening. But I think there's a lot you can learn through reading and being exposed to thinking that you hadn't, I suspect most hadn't thought about before. There's a great piece that came out from the New York Times, in the New York Times Magazine, that came out in 2019 on the 400th anniversary of enslaved Africans being brought to this country. And it's called the 1619 Project, and it was coordinated by a woman named Nicole Hannah-Jones. So just reading these essays will help you to understand a reality that perhaps you don't understand, or books like Waking Up White from Debbie Irving, or Ibram Kendi, or any other. But I think we have to realize that it's a series of learning, that we aren't always conscious of the messages that we have received throughout our lifetimes, from our parents, from our grandparents, from our neighbors, from our friends. And I don't mean messages that are necessarily racist messages. I'm just talking about, who was your doctor? Who were your school teachers? Who was your religious leaders? What were the people who you saw as the leaders in your community? And who didn't you see? When did you talk about race in your household? Maybe never. Or when something negative happened. So just to recognize all of those messages that we have received, and how do we, I call it learn and unlearn, because I think there's so much that we have to learn, and there's so many messages in our heads that we need to unlearn. And it's hard, when you think about history, and realities about historical figures are being revealed in a way that it hadn't been over time. So you think about history, you think of it as something that's set. That's a historical fact. That just is. But the reality is that most of us have not learned a comprehensive history of our country. So there's a lot, Susan. You have to stop me because I could keep talking.
I know it's not an easy question.
Peter Stein, you've got your hand up.
Unmute.
Unmute yourself, Peter. Unmute yourself.
Okay,
There you go.
I'm muted. Thank you so much for a
Yeah,
wonderful
excellent.
presentation. It was excellent, and you covered so much fascinating material. You mentioned that in 2016 and 2018, you developed half a dozen seminars
Mhm.
for top, I assume, top executives and top management. And I'm wondering, to what extent has that education filtered down within such organizations? And also, to what extent has it entered American education, particularly higher education? As a retired sociologist, racism was taught in the race and ethnic groups by the sociology department, but that was an elective. But what about the staff? We had no seminars on racism for the staff or the administrators, which we could have had, but we didn't. What's your sense of the contribution or lack of same by education to
That's a
move
great
things along?
question, Peter. I think that what you described still exists, that we still don't talk about race and racism in professional schools with, it's not part of a required course, be that in high school or college or wherever. As you know from the title of my book, I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and Richmond this year, 2021, has started a course that they call Real Richmond, where it's part of their history that they have developed a curriculum, and it's being piloted in 4 high schools in Richmond to teach a more expansive sense of the history of that city. But Peter, I co-teach a class in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. And I co-teach a class on philanthropy and race. This is the 4th year that I've taught that class. It wasn't until the second, maybe even the 3rd year, I want to say it was the 3rd year, last year, that a light bulb went off for me. And I realized that these young people graduating from Georgetown, who undoubtedly will be leaders in wherever they land ultimately, this particular course, along with every other course that was about race in any way taught in the School of Public Policy at Georgetown, all of them are electives. There's no requirement that you learn about race and racism getting a public policy degree at Georgetown. Now, perhaps that will change, but that is the reality right this minute. So when you think about public policies that impact the public, understanding some of the realities, I remember when the interstate highway came to Richmond, Virginia.
Mhm.
And the interstate went through a historic part of Richmond called Jackson Ward, a historic African-American community in Richmond. And it went through Jackson Ward. My father grew up in that neighborhood. His house was destroyed. His house was torn down as that's where the highway was or his parents' house was. So that decision about where that highway went in Richmond was determined by where it wasn't going. It wasn't going to disrupt a white community. It was going to disrupt a community of lesser power. And if you don't consciously think about that when you're making public policy decisions, you just move on with the way that you always have. So there's now a move afoot in public policy to suggest that there is a need for racial impact statements in the way that there are environmental impact statements. To my knowledge, that hasn't caught on anywhere, but just the fact that people are talking about it, just as we are talking about this topic generally, the fact that Richmond is doing this course called Real Richmond. I mean, I think that there are increasing conversations in a lot of places, but it hasn't been normalized to any degree that I'm aware of anyway, where people are routinely learning about race and racism in whatever professional courses or they are going through.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Twela-Rochelle, you're posting such wonderful things on the chat. Would you like to talk?
Yes, I would. I'm trying to, let me get my bearing together here. Okay. Something going on with my screen. My screen is flashing all these different colors and I see everyone else's face in my camera, but I think that's me. I was just wanting to say that, yes, urban renewals always seem to affect Black communities and disadvantaged people. I'm originally from Akron, Ohio, and I remember they had this thing called Model Cities. And Model Cities was a program where they make the community better. We're going to make the city better. It's going to improve. It's going to offer all these jobs and these things. But then when it went to designing how they were going to do this, these houses of people that I was related to and friends and other folks who own their homes, these people had lived there. They were small homes, many of them, but they raised their children and their homes were paid for. They were given pennies on the dollar for their homes. Many of them were retired or didn't have the income to be eligible to get a mortgage or to purchase another home that would be satisfactory for them or in a neighborhood that would be comfortable for them. So a lot of them ended up living in substandard communities. A lot of them ended up being renters as they were former homeowners, and they never were made whole. And I think it's unfortunate because the word eminent domain shouldn't always be imminent.
You know,
I'm not against improving a city, a state, or community, but I am against not making the people who you disrupt, not making them whole, and just giving them money to move doesn't make people whole.
You know, James Baldwin said that urban renewal was Negro removal. And so that is absolutely what happened. And so I appreciate you bringing that up. But I think the issue around home ownership is a critical one. I mean, if you really look at history, when the Civil War was about to end and General Grant was asking African Americans, what did they need to survive? And people said they needed land because they could build a house, they could farm. And that's where we got 40 acres and a mule, that it was 40 acres that was supposed to come to African American families essentially from plantations in, I believe, South Carolina and Georgia, primarily. And then that never happened. And so we went from being enslaved to being sharecroppers to all kinds of ways in which we did not benefit from the American dream at all. And so we reach a reality now where the last I saw that it was going to take 228 years for African American families to have the wealth. And I don't mean wealth, capital W, wealth, lowercase w, that white families have now. And particularly when wealth in our country is typically acquired through home ownership, that you can, my father owned a small real estate company, so I heard about real estate all my life. And my dad would say, you know, you can live in it, you can borrow against it, you can rent it out. And in his view, that real estate was the most important thing to own. And I know that obviously everybody doesn't feel that way, but certainly I think the American dream is still owning your own home. And that's part of it. That is a core of it. And we have so many African Americans who are unable to own their home, and generations go by where the wealth that people acquired, you know, this is again the story of Debbie Irving talking about the GI Bill and how people were able to buy homes, the creation of the middle class after World War II in particular. Black people didn't have that. If you want a great, really short, Susan asked about this. Yeah, Susan, if you want a great video to watch, it's only 17 minutes long. You can watch it online, and it's called segregatedbydesign.com. It's Richard Rothstein, who wrote a book called The Color of Law.
Yeah.
But the video is literally just 17 minutes, segregated by design, and it explains how we got to the level of residential segregation that we live in today, and the intentionality of this from the federal government and what it has meant.
And it's a first-rate book also,
Yes.
if you want to pick it up and read it. Just really excellent. Judy Berman, you want to say something?
Well, I have another sort of comment question, Tamara. So I was in a conversation not that long ago, and the issue turned to the ward, to restructuring the wards, right? To because Ward 6 has gotten so large, and it turned to the question of Hill East and how at one point Hill East is partly Ward 7. Right, it doesn't actually stop at the river. It crossed, the Ward 7 is on the west side of the river. And the fact that there was an effort to make more of that area part of Ward 7. And it was resisted wholeheartedly by Black and white residents both. Because, and I finally figured, at first I thought like, that just sounded so, I couldn't understand it, like why? And then I realized it was property value. Because property value in Ward 7 has been so undervalued and so devalued that now you're in a situation where people who are currently in Ward, some people who are currently in Ward 6 don't want to give that up, right? Because that would, and the reason I raise this is because I think that sometimes it's easier and more comfortable to talk about kind of the historical issues or the sort of like the over there issues, and yet the issues that are really affecting us, the equity and vaccine distribution, home value in Hill East. I mean, these are the things. This is racism and racist policy sort of in our faces, right? And it feels like what we do about that now as a community matters. I mean, and so how do we? What's the right thing to do here, right? When the redistricting comes up, and it will, right? And some group of residents is going to be, they're going to have to make Ward 6 smaller and Wards 5, 7, and 8 bigger, or Wards 5, 7, and I don't know, maybe 2 bigger. What's the right answer? How do we use this opportunity to bring more equity? Right, rather than just resisting, like I don't know. It's a genuine question about.
No, I think I appreciate your question. I think that the redistribution of wealth, or how do we acknowledge that reality, and what do we do about it?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the answer. I mean, I think it's going to take someone well above my pay grade, but I appreciate the fact that the conversation is underway, because it is much easier, as you said, Judy, to talk about a historical reality.
Mm-hmm.
But if we have the opportunity now to make changes, and I'm sure that everyone on this call knows that there are conversations afoot about reparations. How do we repair? And there are many who feel that there is not an organic, natural way to fix this, that it is such a deep problem and has been in place for so long that we can't do this in small strokes, whatever this is. I don't know what this is. but that it may take something of the magnitude of reparations in some form or fashion to really equalize to some degree what the government has created and perpetuated over time. Maybe others have a far better answer to that than what I just gave.
I'm sorry, Tamara, because my other question had to do with your 7 friends and the ones that went into different schools, but I decided to go in this other direction instead, as long as we had you on the line.
No, I think that's certainly a far more pertinent question that okay, now the problem has been revealed. Now what are we going to do about it? You know, so I, in my talks, I always talk about reveal, reflect, recalibrate. That first we have to reveal the problem. Then we have to think about it. And we may think about it for a while so that we really get it in our head. But at some point we have to recalibrate. We have to fix this. And it may take time. Or it will take time.
Peter, you have one last question.
No, the only variable missing from your rich discussion is called democracy. One person, one vote. And it seems to me one way to deal with these issues to make sure that every citizen has a right to vote and they get involved in discussions about equity, about fair prices, about where people can live, the role of banks in redlining communities and either hiking or lowering prices, you know, part of the conversation, which requires a democratic system to work.
And so many people, the vote is, it appears as if people are trying to prevent so many people from voting. And, you know, there are lots of conversations about that. Even something to me that seems basic as the fact that people who have been incarcerated, once they have served their time, lose their right to vote. And obviously we can have many conversations about mass incarceration, but if you have committed a crime, served your time, and you are released back to society, it seems to me anyway that you should be allowed to vote. So there are lots of ways I think that voting is being suppressed, and certainly there doesn't seem to be a full desire to ensure that everyone can participate in the democracy that we have, Peter.
Thank you, Tamara. This has been a wonderful conversation. I look forward to many more like this. Judy is promising us that we are going to have discussions on racism and equity as we go forward. To all of you, thanks for joining us. And please do join us in April when we're going to talk about the absolutely amazing Sister Dorothy Stein, who gave her life to try to save the Amazon and its peoples. Good night.
Everybody
Night,
unmute
everyone.
for a quick second and say goodnight to Tamara and Trudy.
Thank you, Tamara. That was